So this is an elegant trogon, one of the signature birds of southeastern Arizona. And I'm just going to walk you through birds and birding here in southeast Arizona, a little bit about some of the habitats that are here. We'll talk about some of the common birds that are common to us, but not necessarily common to folks in the other parts of the country. And then we'll also talk a little bit about some of the rarities that have been showing up, it seems, with more and more regularity in the last few years. So here's where we're talking about the very southeastern corner of Arizona. Uh, Most people are more familiar with Phoenix. That's the big city in Arizona. Half the population of the state lives in that one city, but we are even south and east of Tucson. From Tucson, you go down right towards the Mexican border and the border with New Mexico. This is the general area we're going to be talking about. From south of I-10 and east of I-19. So this is the image that everybody has of Arizona, the saguaro cactus. It's kind of the signature plant. In fact, it's such an iconic signature plant of the desert. I see it used incorrectly all over. I've seen T-shirts, that say Houston, Texas, and have a saguaro cactus on it. And Houston is 1,000 miles from the nearest saguaro. But the saguaro is the signature plant of the Sonoran Desert. And the Sonoran Desert goes up through, again, Tucson and Phoenix. And that's the cities that everybody thinks of when they think of Arizona. But we're going to be talking about an area that we call the Sky Islands. And it's these isolated mountain ranges that are separated by desert, kind of like the Galapagos Islands. Each one has its own particular plants and animals that are there. And this map or this particular view shows you that not only do we have Sky Islands here in southeastern Arizona, but a few in New Mexico and even in Texas, the Guadalupe Mountains, the Davis Mountains, the Chisos Mountains in Texas are actually Sky Island mountain ranges. I like this view a little bit better because it shows the way that this extends down across the border down into Mexico. And the combination of factors that give us such a great diversity of wildlife and plants and animals here in the area is from several different habitats that kind of overlap. We do have the Sonoran Desert coming in from the west, but if you fly into Tucson or Phoenix, and most people do, if you're headed our way about 20 miles this side of Tucson, you drive out of the last of the saguaro cactus. We don't have any saguaro cactus down here where we are. We're not in the classic Sonoran Desert here. The Rocky Mountain province comes down to what we call the Mogollon Rim here in Arizona. The highlands up in northern Arizona are really Rocky Mountain influenced. And then we have a little bit of influence coming over from the Chihuahuan Desert, which is the desert of Big Bend, Texas, and the Mexican state of Chihuahua. And then the really exciting part of it all is the influence from the Sierra Madre. These scattered mountain ranges here in southeastern Arizona are just typical Mexican mountain ranges with typical Mexican mammals and birds and insects, but they happen to be on our side of the border now. So that makes them much more accessible. The mountains go up to about 10,000 feet. The valley floor is down at about 4,000 feet. So it's really nice. You've got a variety of habitats there, and you can start out birding early in the morning down in the lower elevations, and then as the day warms up, you move up into the mountain canyons and still get comfortable birding wherever you happen to be. And the Chihuahuan Desert, it looks pretty bleak, and I know, again, I've never been to Vancouver, but I suspect compared to Vancouver, this looks like a really barren area, particularly, not only the Chihuahuan Desert habitat, but when you get out in the grassland. Arizona is shades of brown all the time, except for the short period during the rainy season when everything greens up. And you would think this would be a big disadvantage to bird watching, but it actually is somewhat of an advantage because where you do find good habitat, there's an oasis effect and the wildlife is concentrated where you have water, where you have greenery. I had someone on one of our tours over in the next valley over, which is primarily an agricultural area that's mostly cornfields and cotton fields with a few scattered trees. And they said, boy, it must be really hard to birdwatch here because you just don't have any trees to look in. And I said, well, that's what makes it easy because the few trees that we do have, if you concentrate your efforts there, if you're looking for a great horned owl, he's going to be in that one big cottonwood tree that is in the middle of the cornfield. And you don't have to search all through the forest for him. He's going to be in that one tree that's still out there. So this variety of habitats gives us a whole variety of birds and other wildlife to look at. And we'll talk about some of the different habitats that the birds are in. One of the important ones is our San Pedro River. And again, compared to rivers in Canada, in Washington, in Oregon, this would not even qualify as a creek in most places. You can step across it at times of the year. But in southeastern Arizona, it's pretty special to have any sort of surface water like this. The San Pedro flows north out of Mexico and into the U.S. It does, at this point, still have permanent water there. It gets very low in the dry season and then floods in the rainy season. But that river of water and also the river of cottonwood trees and willow trees is an amazing migration corridor for wildlife. Here's a radar map of springtime. This was April 30th in several years ago. The radar images you're seeing are birds taking off. And of course, in the east, there are a lot more birds that fly at night than out here in the west. But even out here at the west, when you look over here, you can see that the birds come right up these river corridors. Here's the Rio Grande River. Get my pointer over here. Here's the Rio Grande. Here's the San Pedro. And here's the Colorado River. The birds tend to come right up those river corridors as they're migrating. So springtime can be a pretty exciting time when all of these birds from the tropics are headed up your way and headed up to Montana and Idaho, and they start their journey coming right up the San Pedro River. And again, the mountains get up to 8,000 and 9,000 feet. We have aspen and Douglas fir on the tops of these mountains. It's amazing in Tucson. Mount Lemmon, right outside of Tucson, has a paved highway that goes up it. And I noted one time, I think it's 13 miles from the last saguaro cactus to the first aspen. You go through all the different life zones in that 13 miles and go from about 3,000 feet to about 8,000 feet. So I'm going to go through the birds kind of taxonomically, and I'm skipping right over the ducks. Nobody comes to Arizona to see ducks. You guys have got more ducks than we'll ever have down here. The only special duck that we have in Arizona is called the Mexican duck, and it pretty much looks like a hen mallard. So we don't get too excited about ducks. We don't have a lot of shorebirds. We don't have a lot of gulls. So in taxonomic order, I'm going to skip right ahead to the raptors. And again, nobody gets too excited about red-tailed hawks, although our red-tails here in the Southwest are the Fuertes subspecies. They don't have the belly band. They have just kind of a clear breast. And in the wintertime, we get an assortment of birds that come down and spend the winter with us, even Harlan's hawks coming down from Alaska. So we can see birds that are clear-breasted, birds that have a belly band, birds that are cinnamon red, birds that are charcoal gray, any range of red tails you can imagine. We used to do regular, what we call hawk stalks over in the Sulphur Springs Valley. And I told people that my rule of thumb is it's a red-tailed hawk until proven otherwise. If you call them all red tails, you'll be right more often than not. But they do come in a variety of color faces. Swainson's hawks we see in the summertime. Of course, they head to Argentina for the winter, but we have pretty good numbers of Swainson's hawks here. I know you guys do too. The Harris hawks are special in that they are a bird that hunts cooperatively. They're a social hawk, and you'll have sometimes 5 or 6 Harris hawks together that will team up, and like a pride of lions or a pack of wolves will chase down a jackrabbit cooperatively and share in the kill. And they're a Sonoran Desert specialty. We don't see many of them where we are. There are more of them in Tucson, but we do have a few. And the reason I included the turkey vulture here in this slide, nobody gets too excited about turkey vultures, but here we have to look very carefully at every turkey vulture that flies over, because we have zone-tailed hawks. And the zone-tailed hawk looks very much like a turkey vulture, except for the barring on the tail. They have that same kind of bicolored wings, the same dihedral. They fly very much like a turkey vulture. They'll sometimes fly with the turkey vultures. So we have to, you can't just ignore every turkey vulture that comes over. I've had a couple of experiences here in Bisbee where I would just look up and assume it was a turkey vulture, and our backyard chickens that we have will alert me that that's not a turkey vulture. That's actually a zone-tailed hawk. And a couple of the other tropical raptors that we get here are black hawks and gray hawks. A good population of gray hawks down on the San Pedro River. They've now moved up into some of the mountain canyon. And a phenomenon that has just been discovered really in the last 10 or 12 years, there's quite a migration flight of black hawks along the Santa Cruz River. In March, there is a hawk watch on the Santa Cruz, and some days they'll have 15 or 20 black hawks come up, along with zone tails and gray hawks and all sorts of other tropical raptors that, again, are using that river corridor as their migration corridor. The quail are a good example of the way a lot of our species kind of sort themselves out by habitat. Our desert quail is the Gambel's quail, and we have them here in Bisbee. We have them all down in the valley floor. And then the scaled quail is more of a grassland quail. In the last few years, we've been in terrible drought, and the grasslands have suffered, and the scaled quail have suffered along with it. So we don't see scaled quail as often as we used to. And then the real holy grail here is the Montezuma quail, a bird of the oak grasslands. And you wouldn't know it to look at this big, bright male sitting up on a rock, but these birds are masters of camouflage. And they are, they're so confident in that camouflage that if they are spooked, they just squat down in the grass. And the females are pretty much brown and tan striped like the grass, and you can walk right by them. This is a bird that is not really a rare bird. In fact, they're hunted as a game bird here in Arizona, but they're one of the hardest birds for bird watchers to see. And we are thrilled that the new sanctuary that we are managing, I'll tell you a little bit about it later in the program. We've been having Montezuma quail coming in pretty much on a daily basis to our sanctuary. So that's become one of the real highlights of birding at Ash Canyon. But they do sort themselves out pretty well by habitat. Although occasionally the Gambel's quail and scaled quail, where the grassland meets the desert, you'll have mixed coveys of Gambel's and scaled quail, and they even hybridize occasionally. We call them scrambled quail, and they have a little bit of the characteristics of each. And of course, this guy, the iconic bird of the Southwest. It amazes me now watching roadrunners how long it took us to realize that birds are really dinosaurs. These guys are velociraptors. And on cold winter mornings, we see them sitting up with, like this one down here in the lower edge, with their back feathers fluffed up. They're facing away with the sun on that back. They've got a black patch of skin on their back, so they're warming up. They're actually raising their body temperature, which is a very reptilian thing to do. And they are ferocious predators. They eat not only lizards and grasshoppers and snakes, but they'll also eat little birds as well. One of my favorite birds to watch, though. They are a cuckoo. We also have yellow-billed cuckoos, but they are the ground cuckoo, and they're a bird that everybody wants to see when they come to Arizona. And we have quite a variety of owls. We have about a dozen species of owls here in southeastern Arizona, and several small owls. The little whiskered screech owl is very much the same size as a western screech owl, but you can see from the range map here that they just barely get up into the U.S. here in southeastern Arizona. And then this little guy, the elf owl, he's actually in a hole that was made by an acorn woodpecker. This is literally the smallest owl in the world. They are the size of a bluebird. And they're insect eaters, so they leave here in the wintertime when we don't have enough katydids and caterpillars around for them. But they come back every spring, and there are several places where you can go and be fairly well guaranteed to see this cute little elf owl. We also have the northern mountain pygmy owl and the Mexican spotted owl, as well as, the same barn owls and great horned owls and saw-whet owls and burrowing owls that you probably have there in Vancouver as well. So a good assortment of owls. Springtime is a good time to come out for owls because they're much more vocal then, and it's a lot easier to find them when they're calling at night when they're setting up territories. And now we get into the hummingbirds. And if you look through your field guides, you'll see a lot of range maps that look like this. And that's basically the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico coming up into southeastern Arizona and into the Big Bend of Texas. That's the Sierra Madre Oriental and Occidental. And there's a number of species that follow this same basic range map and come up into the U.S. here in Arizona. Our Chamber of Commerce, at one point, they wanted to call Sierra Vista the hummingbird capital of the world until we told them about Ecuador and Colombia and said, wait a minute, hummingbird capital of the world is a little bit too much. We can call ourselves the hummingbird capital of the United States if you want to, but you can't even call it North America because, of course, Mexico is part of North America too, and they have even more hummers than we do. But we do have an abundance of hummingbirds here. And in fact, today at the sanctuary, we had 6 species of hummingbirds today here in December. And they more or less sort themselves out by altitude. The black-chinned hummingbird, which you've got there or at least in the Vancouver area, is a common bird down on the San Pedro River. The Costa's hummingbird is really more of a desert hummingbird. We do see them occasionally, and you see them in Tucson more regularly. They're more of a desert bird. In fact, again, even in the wintertime, you can see Costa's hummingbirds there. And then the beautiful violet-crowned hummingbird is a low elevation hummingbird. When we first came here back in the late 80s, there were only a couple of places where you could go to see violet-crowned hummingbirds. We would go over to a place called Guadalupe Canyon over on the Arizona-New Mexico border to see violet crowns. And then they became fairly easy to see in the town of Patagonia at Patton's house, which is now run by Tucson Audubon. And violet crowns seem to be expanding. And again, I saw there was a violet crown morning at our sanctuary. So they are getting a little easier to find than they used to be. In the kind of middle elevation, of course, Anna's hummingbirds, you guys got more Anna's hummingbirds than anybody. I think on the Christmas bird count, you sometimes have record numbers of Anna's hummingbirds, but you don't have this guy. This is the Lucifer hummingbird. And this is really a Chihuahuan desert bird, but for whatever reason, they have come to be comfortable at our Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary in the Huachucas. And this is probably the best place, the easiest place in the U.S. to see Lucifer hummingbird. The Lucifer hummingbird is more common in West Texas than it is here, but West Texas doesn't have much public land. And there are some feeding stations that have lots of lucifers, but they're in gated communities and not accessible. There is a wonderful place called Christmas Mountains Oasis that has lots of Lucifer hummingbirds, but it's way off the beaten path, and you have to really want to be there to see it. And we're lucky that we have a half dozen to a dozen Lucifer hummingbirds every summer that spend and nest at our sanctuary in the Huachucas. And then the beautiful broad-billed hummingbird. When they're talking about changing the birds' names, broad-billed hummingbird is a pretty drab name for a pretty spectacular bird. This is a bird that is related to the emeralds in South America, and a lot of the South American birds have very evocative names, whereas our hummingbirds are pretty boring in their names. Hopefully someday this guy will be called the broad-billed emerald or something, because they've done that with our the mountain gem, the blue-throated mountain gem, which used to just be blue-throated hummingbird, but they've recognized that it is related to the mountain gems down in South America. And the blue-throated mountain gem and the rivules are big hummingbirds. Now, of course, the rufous is a bird that you guys are very familiar with. We also have Allen's hummingbirds, and distinguishing the two can be very difficult. In fact, frequently we just call them Rufus Allens unless we're able to see the outer tail feathers on the birds. But we do get some Allens in migration here, and Rufus in migration. They don't nest here, but we see a few in the spring and then many more in the fall migration, which for us can begin in July. We have the broad-tailed hummingbird, again, more of a mountain bird. And the rivules. It was rivules, and then it was magnificent, and now it's back to rivules. And they're going to change the name again, and it'll probably go back to magnificent again. Who knows? And in recent years, we've had, again, forgot about the calliope. We do get the little calliope, the smallest bird in the United States. Again, not the smallest bird in North America, because the Mexican bumblebee hummingbird is even smaller, but this is the smallest bird that is here in the U.S. And then we've had some rare hummingbirds in recent years that have become more and more common. The white-eared hummingbird is a high elevation bird, and they have settled in a couple of canyons down from us at the Beatty's Guest Ranch. Pretty much every year you can count on white-eared hummingbirds being around. Also the barreling hummingbird, which was a very rare bird a few years ago, but now it seems like pretty much every year there'll be barrelings show up somewhere. You just kind of have to keep your ear to the ground and find out where they're being seen, but they have been seen at Madera Canyon. They've been seen at Ramsey Canyon. They tried nesting at Ramsey Canyon this year, but were unsuccessful. They're over in the Chiricahuas now, so they're getting more and more common. And then every couple of years we get the big plain-capped starthroat. And this is another bird that shows up at our feeders in Ash Canyon regularly. So we get a fairly good assortment of birds. There have been 17 species of hummingbirds seen in Arizona. Most years we will have 13 or 14 around. Here's a picture of the feeder at Ash Canyon with a broad-billed, a starthroat, a black-chinned, and a lucifer all on the feeder at one time. Not many places in the world where you could see that. And again, a very special bird, the elegant trogon. Gosh, walking in a wooded canyon and hearing that exotic kind of quack, 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 quack call that the trogon gives. Even if you were not a bird watcher, you would know that that's not some little chickadee or titmouse. That's something special. And there are about 200 elegant trogons in the U.S. and all here in Southeast Arizona. Occasionally they show up in West Texas, but they haven't really gotten a foothold out there. And they do nest here regularly. They do a survey every year and check all the mountain canyons. And I think this year, again, they had about 200 birds scattered around Southeastern Arizona. And they are spectacular. One of my favorite birds. You know, you would think you were in the jungles of Guatemala or something other than Arizona. And every few years, not regularly, but every few years, we have their even more exotic cousins show up, the eared quetzal. This bird was in 2020. We had two of them show up over in the Chiricahuas and stay for several months. And the Quetzals and Trogons are closely related, but this guy is even more spectacular than than the eared Trogon. When we were at Ramsey Canyon Preserve, the eared Quetzals showed up for the first time. At that time, they were called eared Trogons, but they actually attempted nesting above the preserve, and they were unsuccessful. They didn't start until late, and there was an early snowstorm and the young died. But we collected the nest contents, and the fact that they had blue eggshells, nobody had ever seen the egg of this bird before. The fact that they had blue eggshells was one of the things that prompted the change of the name from eared Trogon to eared Quetzal. So even though we don't have as many trees as you do, we have a good assortment of woodpeckers. The little ladder-backed woodpecker is our desert version of the downy woodpecker. The Gila woodpecker is our version of the red-bellied or golden-fronted. Acorn woodpeckers. And then we have a brown-backed bird called the Arizona woodpecker. That is, again, kind of an Arizona specialty bird. A few other woodpeckers. We see sapsuckers occasionally. We've got flickers, both gilded flicker and the red-shafted flicker. So good assortment. Flycatchers, gosh, we got 24 species of flycatchers in Arizona. But of course, half of them are just little gray birds that all look alike. So I'm not going to show all of them. I'll talk about just a few of the special ones. And one of my favorites is the vermilion flycatcher. If all flycatchers were as easy to identify as this one, our job would be much easier. Although I say that, and this is a bright adult male, the females and immatures are not bright red, and one of the most commonly misidentified birds. People want to call them a Say's phoebe. They have just a little bit of a wash of pink to the breast. So you do have to pay attention to the silhouette and the posture and all of that. Ash throat, I just threw that in because it's a typical flycatcher. We have quite an assortment of Myarchus and Pittonax flycatchers. The sulfur-bellied is one of our specialties. Doesn't get much further into the U.S. than here in southeastern Arizona. Winters all the way down in Brazil. So this is a bird that we always welcome back. They're one of the last migrants to arrive. And then the last few years, there have been tufted flycatchers show up almost every year, which is a Mexican species. You don't have to go too far into Mexico to find them, but they are now showing up in the U.S. Here in southeastern Arizona with some regularity. Just threw in a picture of a shrike because I love shrikes. And we still have a pretty good population of shrikes. Of course, the bird that's called the butcher bird. Here's one with a mouse impaled on a mesquite thorn. Our jays, again, sort themselves out pretty much by altitude. In the lower elevations of the mountains, we have Woodhouse's scrub jay. In the mid elevations, we have Mexican jays. And then when you go up high enough, we have the Steller's jay. And the parrots are a really good example of that island biogeography of the Sky Islands. Here in the Huachucas, we don't have any chickadees that are found in the Huachucas. We have this guy, we have the bridal titmouse. He kind of looks like a cross between a chickadee and a titmouse, but this is the only member of the parrots that we have here in the Huachucas. If you go over to the Chiricahuas, they have the juniper titmouse. If you go to the mountains outside of Tucson, the Catalina, I'm jumping ahead here, the Mexican chickadee is also in the Chiricahuas, and pretty much the only mountain range that's accessible to the public that has the mountain chickadee in the U.S. Is the Chiricahuas. So the Chiricahuas have all three of these species. And if you go to the mountains outside of Tucson, they have the mountain chickadee. So each little mountain range has its own particular group of the parrots. And here's the range map that's shown for the Mexican chickadee, and you can see there's just a little tiny dot barely into the U.S. here. Our thrashers are mostly down in the lower elevations. They're one of our desert birds. The curve-billed thrasher's call, the wheat wheat of the curve-billed thrasher, one of the quintessential sounds of the desert. And they're by far the most common of our thrashers. But we also have the crystal thrasher with his long, long beak. You got to wonder, they call this one the curve-billed thrasher. This one has an even more curved bill. Texas has the long-billed thrasher, and they're all long-billed. So again, they need some work on the names. Bendire's thrasher is kind of a brushland bird, very restricted range and kind of hard to find. We also, of course, have sage thrashers and mockingbirds. Quite an assortment of warblers. We have, let's see, a dozen species of warblers. No, more than that. I didn't do that. And some really cool warblers. Painted redstart is a Mexican species that just gets into the U.S. Here in the Southwest, and occasionally we get its even rarer cousin, the slate-throated redstart, which is even more of a Mexican species. The red-faced warbler, beautiful, beautiful bird, mostly up in the high elevations. Olive warbler is kind of a conundrum here. He's not really olive and he's not really a warbler. They haven't quite known what to do with this bird. I think it has its own, is in its own family now. And then the rufous-capped warbler is a bird that was a very rare bird a few years ago. And now there are rufous-capped warblers. Pretty much every year there are rufous-capped warblers in 2 or 3 locations. And again, you just kind of have to keep your ear to the ground and find out where they're being seen. And sometimes it takes a little bit of a hike. But this is one of those Mexican species that seems to be expanding its range. And we're seeing it more and more places. And there are some others that show up very rarely. Crescent-chested warbler is one that has shown up. A couple of other Mexican species that show up on occasion. Most people are familiar with northern cardinal, although our cardinal is a little different than the one in the east anyway, and there's some talk that they might be split off as a separate species. And then we have the Pyrrhuloxia, which is, you can tell they're related to a cardinal, but they're also very different. Their crest is a little shaggier. They don't have the red overall. Their beak is a different color and a little bit of a different shape. And I threw in, this bird is not really related to either one of them. The phainopepla is more closely related to a cedar waxwing. It's a bird that is a mistletoe specialist, but with that crest and all, they get kind of thrown in together, and some people call them the black cardinal. But again, they're a very different bird. Phainopeplas are interesting in that they nest down in the desert in the springtime, and then they move up into the mountains and nest again in our rainy season, which is kind of our second springtime. Variety of tanagers, some of which you're familiar with, western and summer tanager. Hepatic tanager is kind of a southwestern specialty. And then flame-colored tanagers, again, a Mexican bird that in recent years has become more and more common here in southeastern Arizona. Sparrows, we've got 31 species of sparrows, and some of them are very commonly found around the country. Everybody knows juncos, but our juncos, we do have the regular dark-eyed junco, but we also have this guy with the bright yellow eyes. We have the yellow-eyed junco. Black-throated sparrow, 5-striped sparrows. Again, it used to take a 4-wheel drive vehicle pretty much to find this 5-striped sparrow. The only place they were found was over right down almost on the Mexican border, the other side of I-19. But in the last few years, they have become, there's a little colony of them that are much easier to get to near Madera Canyon, where people are seeing them quite regularly now. Then the lark bunting is not a bird we see in the summertime. When they're brightly colored, we see them in the wintertime when they're kind of drab big sparrows like this. I used to wonder why Colorado would choose the lark bunting as their state bird, because when we see them again, they just look like a big house finch or something, but they're strikingly black and white when they're in Colorado. And evidently when they were choosing their state bird, you couldn't print in color, so they wanted something that popped in black and white, and they chose the lark bunting. A few more of the sparrows, a variety of towhees, the green-tailed and the canyon towhee. And then probably the closest thing we have to an Arizona endemic is the Abert's towhee. A lot of the birds we think of as Arizona specialties, things like trogons and white-eared hummingbirds, are really Mexican birds that just happen to get into Arizona. But the Abert's towhee barely gets into Mexico. It barely gets into California, barely gets into New Mexico and Utah. Probably 90% of its range is in the state of Arizona. And it looks very much like a canyon towhee, except for this black mask around the face. A good variety of orioles as well, the Scott's oriole, the hooded oriole. There again, I think when they were naming the birds, they kind of messed up. If I was naming those two birds, I think I would call the Scott's hooded, but they didn't ask me. And then Bullock's oriole. And recent years, we've had several street-backed orioles show up as well. So springtime is a really good time to see the orioles out here. Quite a variety of mammals are out here as well. Our collared peccary looks like a pig, but he's really not a pig. He's a separate family entirely, doesn't have a curly tail. This is not the wild boars that are causing such problems in Texas and the Southeast. This is our native peccary, the javelina. Our little cow's white-tailed deer, one of the smallest races of white-tailed deers. We have these guys. This is a coati, white-nosed coati, a member of the raccoon family. In fact, we have three members of the raccoon family. We have the regular raccoon, we have this guy, and we have an animal called the ring-tailed cat that's actually a member of the raccoon family. We've got 4 different species of skunks here, so quite a variety of mammals here. And in recent years, with game cameras being out everywhere, we're learning about some very secretive mammals that are found here as well. There's right now at least 2 jaguars and at least 1 ocelot in our mountain ranges here in southeastern Arizona. 1 jaguar in the Huachucas and 1 jaguar in the Chiricahuas. The jaguars in recent years, in the last 70 years, have all been males. The males are the ones that tend to wander, but this is historic habitat for them, and maybe someday we'll get a female up here and get a breeding population. But it seems kind of, you think of jaguars as being a jungle cat, but it seems odd to see these pictures of them strolling through a desert canyon. And the little ocelot, again, he's not as brightly yellow and black as the ocelots you might have seen in Costa Rica or Belize, but this is the desert form, and they do get up to northern Mexico and occasionally come across the border. So we'll talk a little bit about just birding here, and then I'll wrap things up. The scenery here is wonderful as well. This is a great place for birding, and it's a very comfortable birding area. There are lots of places that you can go. The seasons, springtime is a good time for the migrating warblers. It's a good time for the owls because they're very vocal. It's a good time for the trogons because they are also very vocal. But it can be very dry in April and May here. Our rains come in July and August and September. We get 75% of our rainfall in what we call the monsoons. And people think, oh gosh, I wouldn't want to go to Arizona in August. It's just going to be blindingly hot. But we get these afternoon thunderstorms that cool things down. And again, you have to remember that we are at a different elevation than Tucson and Phoenix. When you look on the weather map and it's 110 in Phoenix, that means it's 100 degrees in Tucson. That means it's 90 degrees in Sierra Vista or Bisbee, 85 degrees. And 90 degrees with low humidity is very comfortable. So it's not blindingly hot down here. And late summer, the monsoon season, is the best time to be here for hummingbirds. We have not only the resident birds and their offspring, but we're also seeing the migrants come through. And that's when we're most likely to get these wandering vagrants that come up from Mexico. So August and September is a really good time to be here if you're primarily interested in hummingbirds. And one of the unique things about Southeastern Arizona is the variety of people that have just put up bird feeders and then invited the world to visit. There are places in Patagonia, in the Chiricahuas, in Portal, in the Huachucas, where you're welcome to just visit people's homes and watch the birds at their feeders. And it makes for a very relaxed birding activity. And this is our Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary. It was a private home that was owned by a wonderful lady named Mary Jo Balatar, and she began feeding birds, and she had a starthroat show up years ago and asked us about it, and we told her, well, that's a really interesting bird. People would really like to see that, and there's a birding festival going on. If you don't mind us putting out the word, you're going to have a lot of visitors, but if you don't mind. And so she said, okay. And she did have a lot of people come watch the starthroat, and she really enjoyed having the birders around. And so she put up a few more feeders, and she put up a donation box. And for the next 10 or 15 years, birders beat a path to her door, and all the bird tour groups would come by. Again, the Lucifer hummingbird adopted her area as a habitat, and it's just a wonderful place to watch birds. Unfortunately, 4 years ago, Mary Jo passed away suddenly, and we were all just heartbroken. We hated to lose Mary Jo as a part of the birding community. And then kind of selfishly, we thought, oh my gosh, we're going to lose access to her yard as well. Whoever buys her house probably won't want to have a birders tromping in 7 days a week, all hours of the day. And but we were very fortunate to find a generous donor who gave us a donation that allowed the Bird Observatory to purchase Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary. We've had other donations that have allowed us to make a number of improvements. The viewing blinds, it's just a really comfortable place to sit and watch birds. For new birders, for somebody making a first trip to Southeast Arizona, to anyone that is mobility impaired, it's a wonderful place. I was there this morning. We do our garden work day on Thursday mornings. We had 41 species of birds, including 6 species of hummingbirds this morning in about an hour of watching. Here's what the feeders look like when the Lucifer hummingbirds coming around and the bird tours are around. So it can get very crowded in the spring and summer. But it has been a joy to be able to carry on Mary Jo's legacy. And here's some of the areas, again, that people visit, from the Whitewater Draw Wildlife Area, which is an area with wintering sandhill cranes. There are about 30,000 sandhill cranes that spend the winter with us at Whitewater. Beatty's Guest Ranch is the place you go to see the white-eared hummingbird. Casa de San Pedro, a beautiful bed and breakfast down on the San Pedro River where we do regular spring walks. Our Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary, George Walker House, is in the Chiricahuas. Good place to see the juniper titmouse, the Rodriguez feeders, Cave Creek Ranch, Jade Jaspers. Those are all over in the Chiricahuas. Patton Center has a very similar story to our Ash Canyon. Walter and Marion Patton invited birders to visit their yards for years. And when they passed away, Tucson Audubon was able to purchase the property, and now Tucson Audubon manages it. Sweetwater Wetlands is in Tucson, and wetlands are hard to come by here in Arizona, so it's worth a visit. Los Ciennegas is a prairie area. The Sierra Vista Environmental Operations Park, birders love to visit sewage ponds. again, wherever you've got water, you've got wildlife, including Willow Tank, which is in the Chiricahuas, a couple of spots in the Madera Canyon. First-time visitor to Arizona, it's worth staying in Tucson for a bit and visiting the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum, getting the real desert experience and learning some of the local desert birds. The Desert Museum is kind of a combination zoo, botanic garden museum, and just strolling the grounds, you can see lots of wildlife within and without the enclosures there. Mount Lemmon, right outside of Tucson. Again, you can go from saguaro cactus to aspen in the matter of an hour or so. Ramsey Canyon Preserve, a nature conservancy preserve that's in the Huachucas, and beautiful, beautiful canyon, hiking trails, and a wonderful place to visit. So with that, I will open it up to questions. If any, I haven't put everybody to sleep, and I hope that you'll come visit us in Southeast Arizona sometime. So does anyone have any questions? Go over here to the chat.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much for showing us the amazing variety out there. So
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please unmute yourself or put it in the chat. Go ahead, please.
This is Adele. We have booked a tour to southwestern Arizona at the end of January. When you talk about what's the best season to see birds in Arizona, you didn't even mention January, February. So we got really nervous. Is that a bad time?
Well, it's not the time you would come for hummingbirds or trogons or some of the neotropical migrants. A lot of the resident birds will be here, everything from roadrunners to cactus wrens to Gambel's quail and pyrrhuloxia and phainopeplas, and all of those sorts of things will be here. It's not a great time for hummingbirds. There's a good assortment of raptors. Again, depending on where you go, you'll probably go to the whitewater draw and see all the sandhill cranes. For a first trip to Arizona, it's not a bad time to come because it can be kind of overwhelming to come at the height of the season because there's just everything is new and it's kind of nice to come in the wintertime and get to know the resident birds and some of our winter visitors, and then you'll have to plan another trip to come back in the warm weather when the neotropical migrants are here.
Right. Thank you very much. This will be our first trip to Arizona, so it's
great.
Perfect. Thank you.
You'll probably see 50 or 60 species of birds that you haven't seen before.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
When you talk about spring in Arizona, that might have slightly different dates than spring here. What time frame do you mean?
Yeah, I'm talking April and May. Our migration is mid-April to mid-May. And by late May, it starts to get pretty hot. And June is the month you want to avoid in Arizona. It's the migration, the spring migration has passed through and our summer rains have not started yet. So June is the time when we try and schedule a trip out of the country somewhere. But April and May can be pretty nice.
Oh, that sounds great. Michelle and I are planning to drive down to Texas for the eclipse in April next year, and so might come back through Arizona. We'll see.
Swing back, yeah. You can come back on I-10 and just drop down. Once you come across the line, drop down to the Chiricahuas, and that'd be good.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much.
The trogons again come in April. The hummingbirds again late April, early May.
I was in on the California Arizona border last week, and I saw this flock of red-winged blackbirds. I thought it was red-winged blackbirds, but it ended up being red-winged and yellow-headed blackbirds. There must have been 4,000 to 5,000 birds in the flock. Is that common?
Yes, yeah. You'll get big aggregations in the wintertime. It's wonderful to watch those swirling masses of
and the species. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Because I thought, wow, this is so abnormal that here we might get 30 red-winged blackbirds in one place, but not like 5,000.
And they'll disperse in the nesting season, but in the wintertime, yeah, the big groups like that are not uncommon.
Okay, thanks.
All right, well, thank you all very much. And I hope you'll come see us, and I hope someday I'll come see you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. That was very enlightening, and I can attest to everybody. I've been on 3 field trips with Tom's group, Southeast Arizona Birding, and they make you feel just like they've been friends for years. So it's very comfortable, very inviting, very warming, and there's no question. There's no such thing as a dumb question. It's always treated nicely and respectfully, and yeah, it's a very, very enjoyable place to be. I found that out. So thank you very much, Tom, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And